Welcome, listeners, to the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo's Tarot Journal and Cartomancy Reading Radio Hour. Thanks for tuning in. By way of introduction, I am the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo, your humble host in this new and exclusive podcast project. Before I explain the Patreon profile, let me introduce the general notion here. I'd like to take the time to explain the why and wherewithals behind how I got to this moment in my life, choosing to launch such an odd project. Of course, there's going to be a bunch of disclaimers, which I will disclaim, and provisos, which must be provisoed. But I genuinely would like to share my honest, intellectual, and genuine thoughts and ideas regarding this thesis of investigation that I would like to propose or advance regarding the subject at hand, which is tarot, or tarot, however you prefer to pronounce it. And more specifically, the investigation of the system as it exists today in our postmodern contemporary world, and what it is and is not supposed to be, and what it is and is not actually capable of being. I genuinely intend this as an unbiased investigation, and by that I mean I don't believe that I am clinging to any pre-formulated ideas. I do have a specific history and a background, as it were, with tarot and things mystical. Any of you who are joining me with this podcast, or for this podcast, from one of my other explorations in podcast world, you know that I identify, for lack of a better term, as a transcendental mystic. There's some sarcasm in that statement. I digress. You may be wondering, why should I listen to such a project? Well, I don't know, because my voice is interesting and engaging, because you too are curious about this supposedly ancient work of art or divination system or meditation system or card game. I'll be frank, I have long been curious if I ever would choose to pursue investigating the tarot the way I am about to. And I will, of course, in due time, explain through flashbacks my history with it. But for right now, I'd like to first acknowledge a few things that should be understood before we even delve into the subject of this mysterious deck of cards. So, independent of tarot and its history and or whatever impression anyone has that might be listening of it, I would like to declare to you the following, that my intent is honest and sincere, that although this is quite honestly sort of advanced, sophisticated marketing for my Patreon page. I genuinely believe that there is a calling for some works of art and entertainment. And that, yes, disclaimer, this is all intentionally designed as spiritual themed entertainment, and I am bound to declare that for legal reasons so that no one gets the wrong idea. But I do sincerely mean it when I say that I have never, do not intend ever to declare myself someone special, someone to be followed, someone to be believed in. The ideas I put forth are a synthesis of a whole wide spectrum of other people's ideas and my own. And I'm not advancing any formal system of belief, and I'm not encouraging anyone to think or look up to me or put me before themselves or any of those sorts of things. I genuinely believe in what I'm doing, and I'm quite upfront about it being wrapped up in a couple of tissue layers of fiction, because I do want to present entertainment, and I do want to publish in the entertainment modality. But I digress. That at the core, the values, the ideas, the theologic and philosophic propositions that I'm suggesting to the world, those are anchored in reality. So it's sort of an interesting genre that I'm trying to carve out. You might consider it a cousin or a bastard child of science fiction. I'm trying to create a sort of transcendental action-adventure spirit fiction, if I may. But I digress. Tarot is one of those systems that exists in the world that I've had a long curiosity to explore, and that now that I feel a calling to include it as a character, as a sort of class of objects, as the poster child of a class of objects in my fictional universe, which I'll explain throughout this journal. I thought it was a high time that I reconnect with it as an actual thing in the real world, reinvestigate, because at one point I did my own sort of half-ass attempt to do what I'm recreating now here in this project, which is, some scientific method light, or what you might call, citizen scientism. And I know that is quickly lumped together with bad, horrible pseudoscience, and I'm not trying to be a bad, horrible pseudoscience con artist. I genuinely am not. Independent of Tarot, part of my disclaimers of disclaimers here, independent of this topic, I consider it one of many topics in the general category of occult or spiritual mysticism or, inherited wisdom from previous cultures, etc. There's a lot of labels you could use here. But independent of the one themed or centered on here in this particular podcast, I do genuinely assert to you, audience, friends, listeners, supporters, that I feel a calling, however imperfect a person I have been and was and probably still am. In my most innocent days, and today is in sort of a reawakening time, as we are all sort of redefining ourselves, either archetypically in our own lives because we do that every few decades, or metaphysically in the real world in our society because the society is sort of begging us to. As part of that transformation, that radical reorganization of myself, I feel a strong calling towards a sort of practicing of intuitive spiritualism. And I know that that's a vague place, and people sort of got a bad taste in their mouths about it, because there's a lot of gurus that ever just, in the end, in the long run, may have said some pretty things, but we're just guys trying to take your money. But in a world driven by imaginary economics, isn't that what we're all supposed to be doing? Is, politely taking money from each other so that we can make this thing we call the economy go round and round? One of the pillars of my approach is simple, and I figure I should explain it now before we go too much further down the rabbit hole. One of the pillars to my approach in life, and in any theosophy or philosophy or spiritual concept or spiritual practice that I might discuss, put forward, suggest, invoke, question, one of the central concepts for me is that life is indeed simply a dream. That divine entity which we almost dismissively and quite foolishly reduce down to 3 little letters, God. We're flattening out a massive multidimensional being that we can't barely comprehend into this little tiny paper cutout angry person that wants us to follow strict rules and adhere to certain diets and kill each other in his name, apparently. But this experience we call life, our own individual lives, our journey, the roller coaster ride that we engage in through the body avatar, to use a technical term, but my body, your body, everyone's body is a movie camera roller coaster body ride for that which we call God. So, God is a unity of consciousness at the center of the entire phenomena, simultaneously projecting the phenomena, everything, the place we call reality, the place we call the universe, the place we call the galaxy, the place we call the solar system, the place we call Earth. These are not really places, but living, organic, conscious, onion levels of fractal self-reference. Because this dream is a womb, an incubator, an egg. Now that's a big, huge, deep, wow sort of thesis. It's a central pillar of a very multifaceted approach that I'm trying to figure out how to live without blindly copying or following any one self-proclaimed guru or teacher, alive, living, or dead. Not because I want to become a self-proclaimed teacher, although I might be accused of that, but rather because I think we all have that in us. It's another central pillar. This is very Zen. I didn't come up with it, but and not all the schools of Zen that contain this live up to it. I certainly don't always live up to it. No one does, I believe. That's part of the challenge. Just realizing you don't live up to it. But in Zen, there's a principle that any human being, whether they realize it or not, whether they believe in it or not, is capable of enlightening themselves, liberating their limited, delineated, individuated life, and transcending it so that they are at once incarnate and in this body avatar, and also at peace in heaven or nirvana or wherever you want to call it, with the divine unity. Those people we call saints, we call enlightened masters, we call prophets, we call messiahs. And although we've got all the stories jumbled up and covered with shit, and displaced historically, none of them are pointing to the right times in history. Why? Because that causes ambiguity and confusion and lack of certainty, which allows those who manipulate the system to keep us pitted against one another, arguing and fighting over bits and pieces, rags and tatters of what was once a singularly understood truth, which is that any one of the body avatars can transcend its limitations and advance to ever-increasing higher states of operation. Now, we clearly have done something in our quote-unquote recent past, And I say that mockingly or somewhat sarcastically, because to us it seems like a long, long time ago, because I mean before written history began. Before any of our known middle-of-the-road, averagely accepted, mundane history ever even started. So behind all of that nonsense, we did something to ourselves and knocked ourselves back a peg or three on the lesson plan of the cosmos, of the universe, of this matrix womb that is slowly giving birth to us. We think we've been born already out of our moms, and we haven't. Like, our mom is the whole envelope, not just this little body that helped make this one component, this one other little body, which is, we as a species are, in terms of the entire physical matrix, just one cog in the wheel of wheels, right? I digress. That being one of my starting points, my central pillars, way aside from Tarot, may be a harder sell, a more difficult idea to wrap your brain around, to swallow, and I understand. So it may just be that this journal will have to be as much about my personal understandings and choices in terms of what I've chosen to interpret spiritually as the truth before we, as we go through the Tarot business. So, digressing back, I hit the disclaimer, yeah? I do not believe myself, nor am I claiming to be a human being with special gifts or special talents, or other than being intuitive and receptive energetically. I don't believe I've ever healed anyone. If in the future I ever claim to heal people, I damn well hope that I only do that because I really literally somehow magically, spiritually achieved the ability to heal people. Not that I am stating that I intend that. I'm saying it is. I believe it is. I split the difference in a lot of these hardline yes/no questions about what is or is not going on in the world. Is there magic? Yes or no? I say maybe, and we just don't get what it is, and we don't understand how it works. Thus, it's magical, and thus it is also easily dismissed and or ignored. So let us come full circle. What the bloody hell is Tarot? Plenty of people have written about it, spoken about it, and I'm sure if you were to hop on Google, plenty of people would turn up explaining it and teaching it to you long before anything came up about this project by myself. And let me be clear, another disclaimer. This should have just been called the disclaimer episode, not really so much the introduction episode. I might rename it. Well, it's a bitch once you've recorded it. I'll have to do a future disclaimer episode because I know that I'm already planning episodes, loosely, and one has got to be about the ethics. There's a lot of instances of like sort of a building of some sort of community consensus around the ethical values that professional Tarot card readers should present, and it's an interesting little dance with society that they're trying to put the best foot forward and not make any claims that will get them sued, which is fascinating. So I digress to a disclaimer I was thinking of making. I am not claiming to be able to teach anyone anything about Tarot. This is a self-guided journey because I have had a long-standing fascination, intellectual curiosity about it. I've done some reading on and off about it. I've never truly practiced Tarot. I have owned Tarot decks and lost Tarot decks. I have been given readings by strangers, something I'd like to talk about in depth, make its own episode, actually. And I have, watched other people get readings on occasion. I've never really gone to a Tarot card reader on the regular. It's just like I've never gone to a massage therapist more than once. I've never gone to a professional Tarot card reader and paid. Every reading I've ever gotten has been someone I know personally, and it's been for free because they believed in it. they continue to. Most of my friends who believe in Tarot believe in Tarot. I am friends on social media with a lot of people who are either enthusiasts generally or professionals trying to make a career in reading and advising people with Tarot. For those curious, it is sort of common and very formally official right now, as I'm sure it didn't used to be back in the day, in reaction to a lot of the problems and drama in the past, to declare that Tarot is in no way, shape, or form any claim of psychic ability. Now, it's funny because there are disclaimers that I will probably be bound to make because I will go into strange topics of conversation, of discussion here. One of them, chief, that I'll have to repeat is that I do not claim to be an enlightened anything. Simultaneously, it has to be acknowledged that I do hold it as one of my personal spiritual religious beliefs that the teachings of enlightened masters, especially those that are universal, unconditional, loving, compassionate, and all-inclusive, are correct and true and should be the guiding principles in our lives. Not because I think so, but because they seem to work and they seem to heal, and if nothing else at the emotional level, actually do some good in practicing. Practicing meditation, practicing the sort of universal acceptance that all human beings are equally bestowed with the same rights, first of all, and fundamentally, and second of all universally equally capable of accessing their birthright, known as enlightenment. In other words, it is not a special reward limited to only those who achieve some special achievement. It is something that the whole species is an inheritance of. We just have been conditioned away from it by our own quote-unquote leaders. But that's a whole other thing. Disclaimer, I'm not out to accuse anyone of anything, especially not in the political realm. I don't know what's going on in the world other than what I understand in reality. So, returning to sort of the thrust of this disclaimer/introduction, I said I would try to discuss the whys and wherewithals. To put it in simple terms, acknowledging the declarations, the disclaimers of modern tarot card readers, that they are not scam artists and that they are not pretending to be something that is physically impossible. There is room in my universe, the way I understand it, for a very real and very true phenomenological manifestation of divinatory practices. What do I mean by that? As a transcendental mystic who takes a postmodern view, I propose to the world that, intellectually speaking, we need to reinvestigate the spiritually marginalized traditions that are, that have been around a really long time, that were common amongst those of the indigenous folks who had deep connection to nature, or that have survived through the preservations of, the quote-unquote secret societies. Why? If so much effort was put into, over the last 3,000 years, to confuse and distract us away from the teachings of the enlightened masters such as Christos and Buddha and Krishna and Mythos, whoever they were, whatever names you want to call them, at some point in our history, multiple individuals seem to have stood up and declared that the everyday status quo, money's more important than anything else, do what the leadership tells you to do, vote the way, course, back then they didn't vote, right? Because democracy hadn't quite been invented. But that all the mundane and normal things, the systems of oppression, were not only morally incorrect, but illusory beyond belief, because they were all mechanisms of this material realm, and that we existed in other levels beyond it. Essentially, my friends, at the core of my understanding, I am convinced, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, to the point of saying, I think the following is a fact that anyone can verify for themselves, should they just be open enough to it and not clinging to the rejection shield, the obstructionist belief that it is impossible. But that God, being the Alpha and the Omega, as he says in every one of the sacred texts in which he describes himself, or herself, or itself, whatever it is, God is the Alpha and the Omega. That is the source, the beginning, the projection, the emanation, the manifestating, and the consumer, the end result, the end goal, the end trajectory, the receiver of the projection, the observer, the client, the consumer, that which takes in that which has been sent out, right? God categorically defines itself, herself, himself as the beginning and creation of everything, and the destruction and resolution and return of everything. Thus, and I hope this isn't some sort of fallacy I'm drawing. If it is, please do come in here with your logistician rules and explain to me how it's fallacy. But if something is both the source and that which constructs all things, and also that which consumes and devours and receives all things, perceives all things, then does it not follow that the same source and trajectory, source and receptor, must also be the things? This is the center of my thesis, in part because I've already sort of done the research I'm about to lay out. This isn't so much, in a way, this is radio drama. I'm reenacting my in a more concise version, but I'm also audio blogging something that I've never done before simultaneously, right? We're going to recap some of the more interesting books I've read about at least the salient points regarding Tarot, what it is, what it isn't. And I'm going to explore for a year's time how I want to learn and design and execute my own Tarot practice, to the pragmatic and practical end of becoming a professional Tarot card reader. Think of it as a reality audio blog of, can this guy train himself to become this and do it professionally? Why? Because I have a curiosity and a set of personal experiences that have, instead of putting me against it, have put me inclined to think that might actually suit my personality and my talents and my skill sets, to provide uplifting assistance to those who need a sounding board. Given the insanity I've just defined as my core principle belief construct, or belief assertion in my real life, in my personal life, I believe in Lakesh. I believe in Namaste. I believe in what's that other one? There's another one that I often sort of point to, but that I am another you and you are another me, and we are all another set of each other's, and the only thing that separates us is the illusion of individuality and the stories that get woven around that or because of that illusion. So my thesis is that given all of that, as crazy as that sounds, it makes sense that Tarot, in this real world, as most people live in it, as the sheeple might experience it, Tarot is one of those things on the fringe of society that indeed sort of seems to mysteriously help or work or render some kind of result in that it survives. The human species is an interesting living case study of evolution gone amok. We've evolved to the point where we no longer really concern ourselves with survival. The primary motivator of evolution. It's the survival of the fittest, not the profiteering. It's not the evolutionary advance is not to become wealthy, but rather to have stayed alive. So what are we doing? How are we evolving? Where is the evolution going? What kind of evolution is happening? Whatever happened to our spiritual evolution? I propose to try to simplify the thesis that Tarot and other systems like it might represent the species-wide memory of might be artifacts of a previous bizarre ancient society, and that I sort of glossed over a bit. Things that survive through history generally tend to survive through history and remain in common use because they somehow function. Things that are useless and silly and don't function and don't perform very well don't stick around. Because human beings being a product of evolution, we sort of put our objects through some sort of evolutionary test, see if they provide for us some sort of benefit. We invented the bicycle 200 years ago or something like that, right? And does anyone remember those really big, funny, awkwardly shaped bicycles that were all the rage for the first 10 or 15, 20, maybe 30 years of bicycling? And then kaboom, they went away. Now, mind you, occasionally the odd bicycle fanatic / nerd or enthusiast will start a trend of bringing them back, but they sort of stay at that place of sort of marginal fascination. Now, is the Tarot a unicycle? Interesting and fascinating, but essentially useless, and only really sort of mildly entertaining for a limited period of time, and destined to always sort of eddy and flow in human memory and human rediscovery? Or is there something deeper available to us? I think if I had opened the project with that question, without having also said, I think you and me and everybody that has ever existed is the same sentient being that we foolishly call God, and that is actually something much different than we define as God, or what we define God to be, maybe my question of whether or not Tarot is one thing or the other would seem a bit more shocking, or a bit more a bit less anticlimactic. But I do sense that maybe I've brought myself and this episode of the show to an anticlimactic place, and not fully achieved any of my goals, because I am a crazy rambler. I digress. My personal interest, is to achieve some, if not all, of 5 goals as I presented in my Patreon page, which, if I was really clever, I left up. I did indeed. Let me read to you from my Patreon page. And we've come full circle. I said I would explain that in a little bit. This journal and radio entertainment project, radio play, radio show, talk show, is going to be a Patreon exclusive for members, subscribers, supporters, whatever you want to call yourselves out there, who choose to support me as an artist vis-a-vis the Patreon crowdsource funding platform. If you've never been to patreon.com, please go. And go to patreon.com/Mr. Zeppo, because that would be my profile. And there I explain a bit about what this whole thing is. And let me entreat to read to you from a bit from my introduction. Tarot has captivated, entertained, and illuminated people for centuries. The tradition of consulting divinatory cards, sometimes known as cartomancy, has survived various cycles of oppression and vilification by the Catholic Church, which, curiously, may have once held it in special esteem as part of its secret hidden doctrine in the 1st and 2nd centuries of its existence. I digress. It continues to surprise and console and give guidance to those willing to investigate its symbolism and archetypes. Tarot, it would seem, persists because it seems to actually work for people. Over the centuries, various theories have come in and out of vogue regarding both the origins and the way in which it might actually function as a tool of divination. After decades of personal curiosity and the occasional sort of poking, prodding investigation, I have finally decided to fully investigate the matter thoroughly myself and share the journey through a personal podcast show. Disclaimer, to be clear, I am not claiming to be initiated in any existing school or tradition, and I do not pretend to be teaching anyone else that which I do not know. This is a record of my own self-taught, self-guided exploration into and experimentation with Tarot as a system of self-inquiry. Remember that phrase. It's important to my thesis. The project sets out to achieve 5 straightforward goals or objectives. 1. To personally reconnect and rediscover Tarot as a system of meditation and divination. 2. To overtly experiment with and attempt to analyze in as scientific a manner possible the Tarot's overall effectiveness over time as a system of meditation and divination. To design and publish an original Tarot deck in collaboration with a visual artist. 4. Oh, I skipped the number 3. Well, I said it now. To recover for posterity and share this journey as a podcast in hopes that it entertains, illuminates, and maybe even helps others in some small way. 5. Generate sufficient revenue in order to successfully transition away from my ordinary day job and launch my own full-time mystical spiritual consultancy firm. So, yes, I have long had the urge, the calling to find a modality of spiritual consultancy that would make sense for me. And I think I've already sort of casually begun my personal experimentation or alchemical, sort of meanderings as a amateur and casual investigator of the mystic, the spiritual, dare I use the word occult. And I think I've got a couple of ingredients that I think all fit and resonate together, and one of them, which I'm the least sure of, is indeed Tarot. In as unbiased a manner as possible for me, given my context and my experience, I would very much like to share with you my journey of researching, investigating, reading about, and actually practicing Tarot, teaching myself Tarot, the way in which anybody else might on their own without creating a podcast about it. To what end? To determine if the literature out there is helpful, to find out what actually happens if I spend a year learning, studying, researching, practicing, with the goal of one day offering consultation services to see if it really does what it seems to offer, if that actually happens, if or if it's just a weird thing that people, that it's pretty art and inspirational words, but it doesn't really do anything. I don't know. I don't come at it with an assumption in either direction. I want to find out if after a year of study I'm fed up and I think I'm just wasting my time, or if I've actually finally sort of landed correctly on some kind of life's calling. And of course, that's sort of a high bar to set. But my time is almost out. I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to direct you to my Patreon page, where if after listening to the podcast in whatever state you've discovered it in, you are supportive and enthusiastic and with disposable income enough to subscribe, as people do on the Patreon, for a modest amount. I'm not asking for a lot. I just think that this and all the other projects that I create can achieve a sort of level of professionalism. I know that, especially for anybody who's been listening to the podcast or anybody who goes over to the other podcasts and binges them, it was ad hoc and crazy and all over the place. This is going to be a very structured and guided thing, although it is still unscripted, because it's an honest exploration, and I can't pre-script my reactions. The only thing I can do is create a lesson plan for myself about how I want to learn to teach myself Tarot, and how to read it, and what to decide for myself whether or not it's actually a genuine transcendental spiritual tool that in truth can help me and anybody else guide themselves better. As I've heard many people describe that it's not that the cards are psychic, it's not that the reader is psychic, it's that we ourselves create barriers to our own self-understanding, and these iconic images and these symbols help unlock our own ability to reason with the ideas and emotions and stresses that we've locked away, etc., etc. It's a big, crazy, not well formulated or not well stated thesis, at least not well stated in this particular episode, because I just wanted to introduce the general sort of notion of where I'm heading, and I'm going to journal about my process and as regular and as often as possible. The next couple of episodes are going to be about my plan of attack for familiarizing myself with the deck itself, and of course introducing the source materials from which I'm drawing my profile for each image and its meaning. So there's always going to be room to answer questions from fans and followers, and since this is going to be a Patreon exclusive, a couple of episodes occasionally will go out in the regular sort of free public stream of my other podcast project, but you're going to have to subscribe to my Patreon page and support, and I only ask $1 a month. There's other tiers for those who really, really want to show strong support, but in terms of getting all the basic content that I'm offering, you just got to sign up at $1 a month, and that's next to nothing, right? Especially if you've already got a Patreon account and you're already supporting a couple of other artists out there. All right, I'm out of time. Thank you very much. Please tune in to my other podcasts. Please have a groovy evening. May peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart. Stay tuned for more.